Good afternoon, and welcome to today's conversation on Europe and America, the way ahead. My name is Tooze. I'm Director of the European Institute at Columbia, and it's my great pleasure on behalf of the European Institute and the Centre on Global Economic Governance at CEPA to welcome today Ambassador David O'Sullivan, who's the head of the delegation of the EU to the United States. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Ambassador O'Sullivan is really perfectly positioned to help us at this time of really acute interest. We won't use the C word. This time of acute interest and energetic debate to think through some of the pressing issues of the transatlantic relationship. He's been ambassador in Washington for about a year and a half now. And served before that as the Chief Operating Officer of the new European External Action Service. In that role, he worked very closely with the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kathryn Ashton, as well as with Ambassador Pierre Vimont, whom we had the pleasure of welcoming here only a month or so ago. Prior to that, Ambassador O'Sullivan was also Director General for Trade at the European Commission from 2005 to 2010. And prior to that, Secretary General of the European Commission in that very important phase in the EU's history between 2000 and 2005, when Romano Prodi was President of the EU Commission and the EU went through its, in some senses, the kind of most ambitious phase of its recent history, expansion, the beginning of the formulation of independent European foreign policy. So initially we had invited Ambassador O'Sullivan here to talk with us about one of the really crucial issues in European-American relations, which is the transatlantic trade relationship, and that is a topic that we'll come around to. But given the scale, I think, of the historic challenges that the EU faces at this moment, I actually wanted to go back into a kind of historian's mode and ask you to reflect a little bit on the trajectory of the EU that I know underpins your deep commitment to the project. Looking back over your biography, on the one hand we see the exemplary career of a brilliant EU civil servant and this culminating stage of your career in Washington. But you were born in the early 50s in the Irish Republic, which is a place dramatically different from the Europe of the present day. And I wanted to start by asking you, and to give the audience a chance to hear your reflections on this incredible trajectory of the last 60 years in Europe's history, and the perspective that somebody coming from Ireland, which has a particular kind of success story within the EU, what that has meant for you personally in your formation.
Wow, I could take up an awful lot of your time with that reflection.
That's the idea.
But, well, yes. I watched yesterday the very good Irish movie Brooklyn, which was set in the 1950s. And I remember well growing up in Ireland in the 50s and 60s, and it was a very poor and backward country, which had many fantastic human qualities, wonderful people, pretty good educational system, but frankly, as we now know, some dark secrets lay there in our treatment of unmarried women or unmarried mothers, unmarried, or of some of the other stories that we now know the truth of what happened. It was also just a very inward-looking country, and it was completely transformed by membership of the European Union. I've always argued that for Ireland, the biggest change that came with the membership of what was then the European Economic Community in 1973 was, of course, it was the investment that came from Europe, and many billions of ECUs, as we call them then, euros now, were invested in the Irish economy, which enabled it to make great progress. But it was really the opening of the doors of windows of Ireland, the cultural change. I saw where the European Ombudsman, though it's a woman, Emily O'Reilly, who happens to be Irish, issued a statement today in honor of International Women's Day on the 8th of March, just recalling that when Ireland joined the European Economic Community in 1973, we had to abolish legislation which made it compulsory for women who married to leave jobs in the public service, because it was felt that women could not hold down a decent job in the public service and take it from a husband looking after his wife and children. And this change was brought about directly by membership of the European Union. And I could list, you know, the liberalization of decriminalization of homosexuality, which only took place in the 90s, took place because of a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And I could go on and on about the changes, and that for me was the biggest benefit of membership of the European Union, apart from the economic progress. It was the cultural, social opening up. And the Ireland, which was able to vote in favour of gay marriage last year, was only made possible through the whole membership of the European Union. And you could say that about nearly all our countries. And the journey of the European Union from the early days of 6 countries in 1957, building reconciliation between France and Germany essentially after the Second World War, to include the United Kingdom in 1973 with Denmark and Ireland. And the joining by the UK of the economic community was a very significant joining, because when Winston Churchill projected a United States of Europe in his famous speech in 1946, he made it very clear that he thought the UK would be outside of that. Maybe they will be again, I hope not. But that the fact that we're still having that debate shows you how profound that accession of the United Kingdom to the European project in 1973. And then we had the arrival of 3 very important countries coming out of dictatorship. Greece in 1981 after the Colonel's regime, Spain and Portugal after Salazar and Franco. And then, of course, the historic enlargement to initially the 10 members of Central and Eastern Europe in 2004, followed by Portugal, followed by Romania and Bulgaria, and now by Croatia. A reunification of the continent. Unthinkable, maybe even 20 years ago, and yet it happened. And this is a remarkable journey on which we have come. And what I would just like to say is that in all the discussion there is now about Europe, what I think needs to be remembered, and I say this particularly about Ireland, is no country has lost its national identity by being a member of the European Union. This is not a massive homogenizing product seeking to produce some sort of one-size-fits-all image of a European country or of a European person. Ireland's international image as Ireland has never been stronger than it is today. And that is because of membership of the European Union, not in spite of it. If you go to Denmark, if you go to Latvia, if you go to Greece, you know you're in Latvia or Greece or Denmark or Portugal. You don't mistake it for, you know, some one-size-fits-all European stereotype. And yet all of these countries are in the European Union. We've agreed to pool sovereignty in many areas, but still retain very strong national identity. So it is really, you know, here you say e pluribus unum, in Europe we say unity in diversity. And long may that diversity thrive, because that's who we are. But I still believe that you can have a strong national identity and be very patriotic about your country, and still believe that it is a country whose future is better guaranteed through membership of the collectivity, which is of the European Union, and the sharing of sovereignty in important areas in order better to exercise that sovereignty, than would be the alternative. So that's the end of today's sermon.
No, but that's the story that makes Europeans proud, and it's good to hear it from you, and it's the story that certainly as an European Englishman makes me proud and will break my heart a little bit if we leave in the summer. So this is an important story, but when a great European politician, undeniably great European politician, Wolfgang Schäuble, was in London last week, and he was pushed over the question which is uppermost, I think, on everybody's minds right now, which I know many people in the audience will also want to ask you about. When he was pushed to explain why Chancellor Merkel did what she did in opening Germany's boundaries, he wasn't invoking pride. What he said was, we acted because we had to save Europe's honour. And that's what he thought was at stake. And these are strong words from somebody like Schäuble. He is a man with great historic vision. He uses those words not lightly. And I think that is a sense of the kind of scale of the drama that we face in Europe, and on Europe's eastern boundary, something like Europe's honour, the thing, as it were, goes to the heart of this story of ascent and of dramatic, historic transformation that you just very, very eloquently described for us, is at stake. So I think it would be fascinating for the audience, I think, to hear, as it looked, say, to the EU delegation this morning, before you came up to New York, are we beginning to glimpse the outlines of some kind of a strategy, some kind of a deal that will allow us to escape from the week-by-week disaster that seems to have been unfolding in front of us? There's a meeting obviously going on right now. Without asking you to pre-commit to any of the details of the negotiations, I know how closely you're in touch with them. But can you give us a sense how the elements of a deal might look and what those consist of, and where you see the scope for constructive emergence from a period of months that have been, I do think, have touched the honour of the European project?
Well, let me just walk you back a little and say, I actually think Europe, and more particularly the people of Europe, have actually got a rather bad press out of this whole business. The origin, we are undoubtedly witnessing the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. But it's the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War, which is happening in Syria. The cause of it is the war in Syria. There are 11 million displaced people in Syria, 7 million of them internally, and some 4 million have fled to neighboring countries. In particular, Lebanon, 1 million refugees out of a population of 4 million. Jordan, I think, just short of 1 million. Turkey, something like 2.5 million. I'm not sure the numbers are precise. And the international community, and I emphasize the international community, failed to solve the problem in Syria. And the international community failed to solve the problem of the refugees in the neighboring countries. The European Union and its member states have been by far the largest donors to the UN agencies in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey for the last 5 years. We have consistently given more money than anybody else. Followed closely, I must say, and I want to be clear on the record, by the United States, which has also given very generously. But the fact is that the shortfall in those countries of funding versus needs is 60%. The UN is 60% short of what they would need to look after the refugees in those countries. That is where this problem comes from. And I'm sorry, that is a collective failure and not Europe's failure. It's the failure of the Security Council to be able to agree a solution in Syria, and goodness knows the Europeans, along with the Americans, have pushed for many years to have a UN resolution to try to stop the war in Syria. We now thankfully have the cessation of hostilities, and we're extremely grateful for all, particularly Secretary of State Kerry has done to broker that. We hope this is the beginning of a process which will enable us to have a political process and turn a corner in Syria. But I just want to be clear that the origin of this problem is not Europe. When the money started running out in the camps, the people started walking towards Europe. Initially down through the smugglers' route coming into Libya and crossing the Mediterranean. And for at least, I would say, 2 years, if not 3 years, the Italian people and the Italian government have single-handedly been rescuing people at sea, opening their doors, their schools, their homes to refugees on their own, with very not much help from the rest of us, and saying there's a problem. Then we managed to intervene, and it is true that some 3,700 people have died crossing the Mediterranean trying to get into Europe. We have rescued 250,000 people at sea. So I get a little bit annoyed when people say, well, these Europeans aren't doing anything, and where's their humanitarian instinct? I think the people of Italy have shown remarkable generosity. I think the people of Greece have and continue to show remarkable generosity and compassion. And when you saw photographs of people on the island of Lesbos, by the way, Greece, a country that's going through unprecedented economic strains, struggling out to sea to haul people in off the boats, bring them to their homes, provide them with food and shelter. And even today in Athens, when people are wandering, elderly women are coming from their homes to bring the refugees water and food to try and alleviate the situation. The fact that Germany opened its doors in the way that it did, Sweden, other countries as well, have shown great generosity. So, if I may say so, when I hear that this is a catastrophe and a disaster, yes, nobody can feel happy with the way this thing has unfolded. But I genuinely feel that Europe and the people of Europe have responded with enormous humanitarian reflexes and compassion. And I just ask you honestly in this room, 1 million people in Germany would be the equivalent of 4.5 million people here. How do you think the United States would have reacted if you had 4.5 million people coming across your southern border? So, that's just, if you like, to do a little corrective on the sort of general narrative. Having said that, do I think that we can be proud of what we have done? No, I think we need to do even better. And I think this is a multi-tiered problem because there is a conflation between two different types of migration here. One is asylum and refugees who have international rights and obligations to which we as Europeans are fully committed. Someone turns up on your doorstep and says, I'm fleeing from conflict and I need asylum. They have the absolute right to be brought in, to be sheltered, to be fed, to have their children looked after, while we decide whether they meet the international criteria. Of course, if they don't meet the international criteria, then they must return. Many of the people who are coming as part of this wave of refugees are also economic migrants, openly admitting so. They simply are people who would like to move from an economically difficult situation to a better life in Europe. Nothing wrong with that, please don't get me wrong. By the way, my personal view is we need more migration in Europe. Not necessarily a popularly held view, but I think objectively with our demographics, we need more migration. But it's a separate issue to dealing with the immediate plight of refugees and asylum seekers. The challenge has been to deal with this situation when people are basically arriving through the main corridors, which were initially Italy, now increasingly Greece via Turkey, but they don't want to actually stay in Greece. They actually want to go to Germany or to Sweden, where frankly the conditions of reception for asylum are more generous. And this creates a huge problem then for the Greek authorities, for example, because people don't actually wish to claim asylum in Greece, they actually want to move on. So the challenge has been, how do we, on the one hand, secure our external borders, not to close them, but to better manage the flows in an orderly and organized way. Because the problem we have politically in Europe is that when our citizens see photographs of people pouring across borders, apparently at will, they become very nervous. Not that they're not generous of saying we must help asylum seekers, but people think, wait a minute, is there any limit on this? How many people are going to cross, under what conditions? So we have to get the situation at our external borders under control. We then have to help the frontline countries, particularly Italy, but also particularly Italy and Greece, who are going to bear the brunt of the new arrivals, better to be able to look after those people in a first phase. So that's why we call reception centers, to begin the process of opening the files on these people, fingerprinting, photographing, establishing the dossier on which their application for asylum will be judged. And then we have to better organize a redistribution of these people around the 28 member states so that the burden does not fall so heavily on the frontline states. In parallel, we need to work with the transit states, in particular in this case Turkey, to try to reduce the outflow, particularly of people who prima facie do not have a very good case to be refugees. And then finally, we need to work on a solution to the problem of origin, which of course is the civil war in Syria, and fix it. The difficulty is we have to do all of this simultaneously. And of course, I haven't mentioned the problem of the Western Balkans, because as some of you who are students of geography will know, Greece is not actually directly connected to the rest of the EU, other than through the route of the Western Balkans. And of course, there is a risk, and we've seen some of this, of a sort of beggar my neighbor policy, where one country starts to close frontiers, which pushes the problem onto another country, and then they're forced to close frontiers. And this is where we need a better coordinated European response, so that we don't leave any one country faced with an unacceptable burden or an unmanageable problem. But this is challenging. This is what we're working on today. Two things. One, hopefully reaching a better arrangement with Turkey, in order that Turkey makes a better effort to stop the flows into Greece. As part of that, we've offered 3 billion euros for assistance to the refugees in Turkey. It's very important I clarify, this is not money given to the Turkish government. This is money given to NGOs and other charitable organizations or the UN agencies directly to look after the Syrian refugees in Turkey. So it is a contribution in some ways to the Turkish economy, but it's not actually money which goes directly to the Turkish government. And we also want an understanding that Turkey will take back those people whom it's ultimately decided are not asylum seekers, but rather economic migrants, and that they would return to Turkey. It's hugely complicated, but I hope that today will mark a turning point in a more coordinated European approach to what is a hugely difficult problem. And above all else, and let us never forget this, it's a human problem. At the end of all of this discussion, all these conversations, there are families with children, there are people who walked hundreds of kilometers, thousands of kilometers, who've given up all their savings to smugglers in the desperate hope of getting out of war-torn Syria into a place where they can build a better life. And we have to understand that. On the other hand, we also have to understand, let us be frank, there are political constraints, domestic political constraints in Europe to our absorptive capacity, to how many people we can legitimately be able to take as this process goes forward, particularly when you realize that in our immediate region there are some 25 million displaced people. They simply cannot all come to Europe in decent conditions. So we're going to have to find a better way of dealing with the problem. Sorry, that's a rather lengthy answer.
No, that's excellent. I mean, and it provides, when we start talking about the macroscopic picture, the demographics in Europe on the one hand, the limited absorptive capacity, the huge scale of the question of displacement, it's difficult, isn't it, to get away from the fact that this entire discussion takes place against the backdrop of really quite profound, well, pessimism's too strong a word, but anyway, a gloomy economic picture, one which for many millions of Europeans is one of unemployment and has been ever since the bursting of the bubble in 2008. And notably Greece, of course, which is in the front line in both crises, as you pointed out. And where I think, according to the press release from the EU delegation, I think Europe as a whole can expect something like 0.9% per annum growth. And as you then go on to say, against that backdrop, we obviously have a huge stake in anything that might promote growth. We have a fundamental interest in the West, both in the United States and in Europe, in facing head-on the so-called headwinds, which many economists believe are condemning us to an era of secular stagnation and very low growth, which in Europe runs up against acute social crisis and the question of refugees. And so then I think against that backdrop, the TTIP issue looms large. And as you point out, the promise of a trade deal between the United States and Europe, given that these are already very well integrated economies, the promise is not spectacular. But nevertheless, it's in the order of 130, 140 billion euros plus that's on discussion, which is 0.5% of the Eurozone, which would basically raise the EU's growth rate by 50%, at least for 1 year, from the modest level at which it currently operates. It's worth the candle. This is something that's really worth pushing for. Hopefully, presumably, it will unleash longer-term dynamics and growth. So it would be very interesting, I think, to hear, before we open this up for questions from the audience, your assessment of where we stand with the EU-US trade deal, what you see as being the stakes, and what the likelihood is of any real progress in the foreseeable future.
May I just say a word about the European economy more generally before we do that? I think the numbers are slightly better than you say. The European economy in the last 2 years has basically turned a corner. All European economies will now have positive growth. From memory, but you're reaching for papers, so I probably quote something I wrote which contradicts me, but I seem to recall that actually the projections were for the EU as a whole just about 2% this year and slightly better next year, and slightly lower for the Eurozone, so I think 1.7 or so. But basically positive growth, helped by the triple advantages of a fall in the ECB quantitative easing, the depreciation of the euro, which was not a policy objective, but which flowed from the loosening of monetary policy, which is great for the European economy, not so good for those of us who work in the United States and who are paid in euros, but we'll take a hit for the greater European interest. And the fall in oil prices, because normally a depreciation of the euro, the big downside would be the fact that our primary import, which is energy, would increase, and then the benefits of the devaluation would be lost. So we've actually had a double benefit. And so I'm actually cautiously confident that the European economy has turned a corner, and that the many difficult and painful structural reforms which have been taken in many European countries are starting to pay off. If I look at Ireland, which has just emerged from the bailout program, the projection is 6 to 7 growth rate, 6 to 7% growth rate, and Spain and Portugal are also posting higher than average growth rates. Greece is a bit the outlier, but it's worth bearing in mind that just before the elections in Greece in January of last year, Greece was projected to grow by 2% in 2015. Now, then we know what happened, and they unfortunately have slipped back. So I think the economic prospects for Europe are slightly better, except for the fact, of course, that we, like anyone, would be enormously affected by a global downturn, and the problems of the emerging economies in particular have to preoccupy us. So I take your point that there are worrying signs in the international economy. Now, but I agree with you that one of the beneficial and the sort of deficit-free growth measures which you can take is trade opening, and I think the United States has just concluded a very ambitious deal with the Pacific, the 12 Pacific countries, or 11 Pacific countries. We wish that deal well. I hope it will be approved, and well, it's been signed, but I hope it will be approved and enter into force quickly. It would be a benefit to everyone, including the Europeans. We ourselves, on the EU side, are heavily engaged also in Asia. We're negotiating with Japan. We hope to finish by the end of the year. We just concluded with Vietnam. We're negotiating with Thailand, with Malaysia. We've concluded recently with Singapore. We've just opened negotiations with Philippines and Indonesia. We're actively engaged with India, and we have a summit coming up with India at the end of this month, which I hope will give new impetus. And we also announced that we're going to be negotiating with Australia and New Zealand. We've just finished the most ambitious trade deal we've ever done with any country with Canada. And we are revitalizing our free trade agreement with Mexico and with Chile, and we're engaged in very well advanced negotiations with the Mercosur countries. So we are also operating on the basis of a very ambitious trade agenda, but it would make perfect sense in that context for ourselves and the United States. The transatlantic economic corridor is the most vibrant economic corridor in the world. This is sometimes forgotten, because we both naturally look to Asia, because that's where probably the greatest source of new growth is going to come in the 21st century. The fact is, I just quote one statistic, I'm sorry, once again it refers to the country I know best, but American companies make far more out of their investments in Ireland than they do out of their investments in China, and I mean far more. And the same is true, they also make more money out of their investments in Belgium than they do out of their investments anywhere in Asia. We create 15 million jobs across the Atlantic. We have massive investment, EU investment in the United States and vice versa. And while our economies are extremely open, there are still high tariffs in certain areas, and there are still non-tariff barriers, and there are still regulatory practices which make it which make it more expensive to operate transatlantically than it is to operate in either of our markets. Just a couple of examples. For pharmaceutical products, very often we test to exactly the same high standards on both sides of the Atlantic, but if you've tested your product in the United States, you can't sell it in Europe, and if you've tested your product in Europe, you can't sell it in the United States, you have to repeat the process. So in this trade deal, not only are we looking at eliminating, as far as possible, tariffs, and non-tariff barriers, but also regulatory cooperation, not to lower our standards, not to interfere with the ultimate autonomy of the regulators on each side, who have to be answerable for the quality of their monitoring of respective high standards. But we believe there is a lot that could be done to reduce the cost of regulatory burden on businesses across the Atlantic, which would generate new activity. So this is why we think this is a hugely important deal, and why we think it is not something to be feared. I realize some people have created a lot of scare stories about TTIP. One of the difficulties of the TTIP debate is it doesn't exist. The text is not available. So of course, anyone can say can accuse TTIP of having any effect. And when I listen to some of the critics, I think, well, if TTIP turned out like that, I would be against it. I wouldn't vote for it. The fact is, we are not going to produce a TTIP which has negative effects on either side of the Atlantic, because we know it would not be approved democratically. And in both sides of the Atlantic, TTIP will have to be approved fully democratically. Here, it's going to have to be signed by a president and ratified by the Congress. In Europe, it's going to have to be approved by the Council of Ministers, by the European Parliament, and subsequently by each of our 28 national parliaments. So when people say to me, TTIP is undemocratic, I really wonder what they mean, because more democratic than that, it's hard to imagine. It will have to pass the ultimate test of democratic scrutiny and approval. So I think it's a huge opportunity. We are well advanced, but it's worth bearing in mind that in July, we'll have been negotiating for 3 years. I jokingly said over lunch that, how long does it take to negotiate a trade deal? I negotiated a trade deal with South Korea, it took 2.5 years, but we've been negotiating with the Gulf Cooperation Council for going on 29 years. So somewhere between 2.5 and 29 is your possible number. I sincerely hope it'll be closer to Korea than to the GCC, but it took us 6 years to finish with Canada. It took the Pacific countries 6 years to finish TPP. So I don't know if we can do this by the end of the year. That's our objective. That's the objective we've set ourselves. That's what the negotiators are working towards. Only time will tell.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from the audience. While the mic is circulating, I will indeed come back to your press release. So the latest GDP data for the Eurozone is 0.9% growth in 2015. So it's a historic number. And the data you're predicting are here. Can we have a question from the gentleman on the right-hand side? Thank you.
If the UK votes to leave the European Union, is it a good time to reunite Ireland?
Well, actually, one of the things I didn't comment on when we were talking about Ireland in the European Union, but with the professor beside me, and I was tempted when he made the remark, I don't believe that the peace process in Northern Ireland could have happened without joint membership of the European Union by the United Kingdom and Ireland. I believe that profoundly, because it was that produced the breakthrough in the relations between Ireland and the United Kingdom, which ultimately laid the foundation of a New Deal on Northern Ireland, which, by the way, is deeply rooted in the principle of consent, that there will be no reunification of Ireland without the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. Honestly, I don't know when and how or whether they will ever reach the conclusion that they would rather be part of the United Ireland than part of the United Kingdom, and honestly, I don't care. I think we're fine as we are. We have peace in Northern Ireland, we have coexistence on the island of Ireland, we have coexistence between Britain and Ireland, and long may it stay that way. And if someone wants to change it, fine. If we never change it, fine. I am not at all convinced that the United Kingdom will leave the European Union, but I don't believe that the issue of Irish unity will be affected one way or the other by that decision. I believe that decision could have damaging consequences for the United Kingdom, damaging consequences for Europe as a whole, but that's a separate issue.
The questions here, gentlemen.
I have a question on logistics. You represent 28 countries in Washington. each one of those countries has an embassy and ambassadors in Washington. How does it work?
Very well. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's worth stepping back for just a moment, because when we were creating the European External Action Service, European Diplomatic Service, which is the 6th largest diplomatic service in the world, we have embassies in 140 countries. Very often, there is the European Union delegation and maximum the 3 or 4 embassies of our member states, sometimes not even. I'm thinking of Africa, Latin America, parts of the world where most of our member states no longer feel it's worth their while to have an embassy. And so it's extremely useful to have the European Union delegation, which in the first instance is the vehicle frequently for the delivery of development assistance, but increasingly also plays a more traditional diplomatic and foreign policy and security role. I can assure you that Washington is the one place where we're always going to have 28 embassies, or as many embassies as we have member states. America is the privileged partner of all of our member states. For all of them, the relationship with America is very special. But their job is essentially to represent their bilateral interests. They are there to project the bilateral relationship between their country and the United States. And there is a natural complementarity between that and the work that I do, which is to represent the collectivity of the European Union, whether that is in areas where we clearly have exclusive responsibility, for example, trade negotiations. It's the European Union that negotiates, not the member states. Or whether it is in matters such as digital issues, such as the Privacy Shield, the whole debate we just had about data flows. So issues which are naturally the exclusive responsibility of the European Union, or whether it is foreign policy, security issues such as the Iran deal, which was chaired by Federica Mogherini as the High Representative of the European Union. It is the External Action Service, the diplomatic service of the European Union, which is charged with the implementation of the Iran deal and overseeing it. But I had to work extremely closely in Washington with my British, French, and German colleagues, because those countries were also part of the P5+1 formula, which negotiated the Iran deal, whether it's sanctions against Russia for what is happening in Ukraine, which are EU sanctions decided under EU law, and with whom we have a very important discussion with the United States about the functioning of that, as well as our general policy towards Russia in the context of the Ukraine conflict. So there's a natural division of labor. I work very closely with all of my member state colleagues. I chair a meeting of my ambassador colleagues over breakfast once a month in my residence, where we compare notes, and we have once a week a meeting at deputy head of delegation level, and we have weekly meetings of the trade councillors, political councillors, financial councillors, scientific councillors. So we work very, very closely, full transparency between us, and I believe that member states find that their relations with the United States are enriched by the fact that they have not only a bilateral relationship, but also a relationship with the United States through their membership of the European Union, which is also an important partner in the transatlantic alliance.
Question here, the lady whose glass is just behind the last question.
Thank you. Cynthia Roberts, I teach European security here. So one area where pooling and sharing has not worked well in Europe over many decades, despite many headline goals and UK and so on, is in the area of defense. And the United States has signaled to Europe many times that it doesn't want to spend 75% of the NATO budget or more for European security than Europe spends, given Europe's wealth. So looking forward, do you see any sense, one day the US may actually really pivot to Asia, where crises may loom larger? So will it take the US leaving, which it doesn't look likely anytime soon, for Europe to do more? Or will this not happen because the divisions in trying to master these 28 countries coordinating is so large? Thank you.
Well, I agree with you that defense cooperation has not been a sort of priority area for European activity. I mean, there are two reasons for that, I think. One, psychological, if you like, but which is very important, and we should be aware of it. I was saying to some of the colleagues over lunch, I'm part of the generation who grew up believing we were building a Europe in which we wouldn't need to go to war. I mean, that's what we were trying to build. So we weren't building a place where we would have bigger and better armies. We were building a place where we would lead smaller armies and we could spend more money on education and healthcare and other matters, because we would create an architecture in Europe which wouldn't need the possibility of recourse to violence. And that was, really our great hope after the collapse of the wall, after the new independence of the countries of the Soviet bloc, the changes in Russia, the liberation of the Baltic states. We really thought we were entering a new universe in which everyone could peacefully coexist in Europe, and we could concentrate on how we could cooperate economically and in other ways, and frankly we wouldn't need big armies because there would be no threat. Let us be very clear, what happened in Georgia in one way, but certainly what happened in Ukraine has dramatically changed that environment. And I think it's taking people a while to adjust to that new world. Of course, it's not true that we don't spend money on defense. If you add up the defense budgets of the 28 member states, we're actually the second largest defense budget in the world after the United States. We spend more than Russia, more than China at the present time on defense. I'm just not sure that we get as much value out of that defense budget as perhaps we could. And that's a debate which is ongoing now, because unfortunately I think security is back. I think unfortunately the annexation of Crimea, the interference in eastern Ukraine does put the issue of military force back on the agenda in a way we would never have wished, but it's a reality. And I think there are ongoing discussions about how this will affect us. One of the most important things would be more cooperation, because the second reason why people did not, why defense at EU level was not so important is because NATO was the main pillar. And for a long time there was a debate seen, it was either NATO or European cooperation, and they were seen as antagonistic. I think that debate is over, and I think neither the folks in NATO, nor the US, nor in Europe see any antagonism between having a strong EU defense capability developed as an integral part of the overall NATO strategy. The big obstacle is, of course, the problem of Turkey and Greece over northern Cyprus. If ever we can solve the Cyprus problem, I believe we would unlock a new era of greater cooperation between the European Union and NATO, which would be very important. In the meantime, we have developed a security policy and a common security and defense policy. We have 7,000 military and civilian and police units around the world engaged in military missions, military and civilian missions. We've had military missions in Chad. We have a naval force off the coast of Somalia, which has been highly instrumental in killing off the piracy, which was so prevalent in that area. So we have the beginnings of a European defense cooperation policy, but it's in its very early stages. I agree with you. And we will certainly have to see how we can do better, particularly if we could reinforce the cooperation between the EU and NATO.
Question. Do we have one over this side? Gentleman here.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to address my question on the international refugee crisis. And my question is, how can those EU member states that are, due to domestic pressures, reluctant to take in more refugees, how can those states be motivated to cooperate to a greater extent? Thank you.
Well, I think we have to recognize that amongst our 28 member states, there are different historical experiences with migration, immigration, and some who particularly were shut off from international contact through Soviet domination through the many years after the Second World War, didn't have the same exposure to migration and migratory flows as other parts of Europe. And therefore, the idea now that they might find themselves in that situation is not immediately comfortable. And I think we have to understand that. I don't think it's much of much use to recriminate backwards and forwards. There's probably too much of that happening at the moment. On the other hand, I think it has to be understood that Europe functions on the basis of a sense of solidarity between countries. And solidarity means that when I've got a problem, you help me, and when you've got a problem, I help you. And I think that is the ultimate argument that has to be deployed in all these situations, is to explain to countries, sometimes you do things that you would not necessarily volunteer to do for your own sake, but you do it because it helps others, because they will then help you in other situations. I take again the example of Ireland, which is not part of Schengen, but which offered to take 4,000 refugees. Why? Because the Irish said, well, if this is causing a problem for Greece and Italy and Germany, we should contribute to helping, because we have asked those countries to help us in difficult situations in the past. And that, I think, is the spirit which should be motivating us. If you actually, the absolute numbers we're talking about in terms of asylum seekers, 1.25 million last year, maybe a similar number this year if we get to 2 million. I mean, I already explained to you, on one level it's quite a big number. I mean, if you try to drop that many people into one country, even Germany, it's quite a big number. If you spread it across 28 member states, 508 million people is the population of the European Union. That becomes a much less threatening number and a much easier number to manage. But that assumes that every country agrees to take a certain proportion of the asylum seekers. And I think that is an important principle which will have to underpin a European solution to this crisis. It doesn't have to happen immediately. I think there has to be discussion about how and under which circumstances, give people the time to prepare to receive asylum seekers. But it's clear that we cannot ask the frontline states, Greece and Italy, but even the countries where people might ultimately wish to end up, such as Germany or Sweden, that there is a limit to the absorptive capacity of a subset of our countries. So that there has to be a European solidarity in seeking to spread the housing and the caring for asylum seekers while their claims are processed and their ultimate fate is decided across all of the member states. And this is going to be absolutely an indispensable part. But I think we should show sensitivity and an understanding to the fact that for some countries this is difficult, it's new, and we know how sensitive the issue of immigration is everywhere. And I think we have to also understand that. We can't simply say that this is xenophobia and populism and just dismiss it. If people are worried, their worries have to be addressed. They have to be given some assurances about how their concerns will be addressed and how this will all be managed in a way that is compatible with the kind of future they see for their own country. I think this is possible because, as I say, if you divide the numbers up amongst 28 member states, ultimately they become much smaller and much more manageable.
Question at the back. Friend with the glasses.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I had a small question. I'm a lawyer, Walter Schmidt from law school here. As a lawyer, I'm a practical person. So on the
Really?
Yeah. Well, I try.
It's an oxymoron. I think.
Well, let me. Put
Sorry,
you
it's not my daughter's a lawyer.
The solidarity principle in Europe. The EU deal with Turkey just broke in a draft form. It is now clear that the EU has committed to taking, to sorting out the Syrians one for one, and that means it'll take at least half, 48%, of the historic flow into the EU. This is on Reuters right now. The problem with that, I think, is that if the solidarity principle within Europe is agreed on, then how will the resulting refugee stream be reallocated in the knowledge that the present reallocation stream of a couple 100,000 is an absolute disaster and is basically dead. It has not been executed, and even if it were the basis of a plan going forward, politically that is going to be hard. Can I tease your brain on that?
Thank you for
taking that question.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question. And I'm sure lawyers are very practical people most of the time. Look, you know, when people say, oh, this hasn't worked or that hasn't worked, this is an unprecedented crisis, right? And just like when we had the financial crisis, which also wasn't invented in Europe, and for those of you who watched The Big Short,
Deutsche Bank.
It exposed weaknesses in the architecture of the way we had constructed monetary union. Namely, we had done certain things at European level, but we had left other things to the national level, and then this didn't work when you put under strain. So that's why we had to invent a bailout mechanism, the European Stability Mechanism. We've had to invent banking union. We had to invent more multilateral monitoring of member states' budgetary policy to make sure that people's fiscal situation did not get excessively out of kilter. So we had to put in place a whole new series of means of dealing with the possible stresses and strains on economic and monetary union. We did that, but it took us some time because these things have to be approved by, in the case of the Eurozone, 19 sovereign countries who have to vote and in some cases have referenda on the steps which need to be taken. But we got there, and we have done it. We're now dealing with an unprecedented strain on our refugee and asylum policy, which was also partly divided between European measures. Certain rules were decided at European level, and the implementation was left to the national level. And now we're discovering, under the stress of these flows, which are unprecedented, I come back to my point, the numbers are in absolute terms not huge, but on the other hand, they are multiples of what we've had to deal with in the past. So you could say, well, you should be able to deal with these numbers, but they're many times what we've had to deal with in the past, and our systems just weren't able to cope. The question is, can we now simply leave the system in place? No, we have to change it. So we are, for example, we have proposed the creation of a European border and Coast Guard structure to better secure the external frontiers and to help member states who find they haven't got the resources to cope at their frontier with a massive increase in migration flows, in particular asylum and refugees. We have to be better able to offer humanitarian assistance to refugees who flow into a frontline member state. We've just agreed the unprecedented step of 700 million euros humanitarian assistance to help in Greece. The difference being that this is quite different from any other kind of expenditure we've had in the past, which flows through national governments. This is money that can be given directly to NGOs working or UN agencies working with the refugees in Greece. This is a massive innovation. It's an improvement. Relocation. Relocation is at the core of solidarity. And I have no doubt that we will finish by having a system of relocation of asylum seekers from frontline states to the other member states. I'm absolutely certain that that's where we will end up. But for the reasons I explained to the previous questioner, it takes time. It doesn't happen instantly. So you say the scheme is dead. No, it's not dead. But it has not moved as quickly as we would wish. But we will get there. I'm sorry you smile, but we're dealing with democracy. Can we please just get this right? At the end of the day, we need the democratic approval of each of our member states for these kind of changes. And this cannot be conjured up at the clicking of a finger or a technocratic decision of senior officials meeting in Brussels. You have to go back and you actually have to get the votes in Parliament. And that's how it should be. Because democracy is ultimately our highest value. And if it takes longer, and it's a bit more efficient, but it's more democratic, then that's the route we will go. And we will get there. I promise you, we will get there. And we will look back in 2 or 3 years on this crisis and say, what an amazing turning point. Look at the new instruments the European Union put in place. In the short term, it is messy. I don't disagree. Again, I ask you, if you were faced with 4.5, 5 million people coming through the Mexican border, do you think you would really, really be responding so much better than we are doing now? I only ask the question respectfully. And so I think the glass is half empty, the grass is half full. I don't know exactly what's been decided today, but in any event, we will not close the door to refugees. We have international commitments, we will continue to receive them. The issue is, how do we do that in the best conditions? How do we do it in a way that does not put a disproportionate burden on the frontline states, or indeed on our neighbors in the Balkans, who are now unfortunately a part of this conundrum? And also, how do we best look after the interests of the refugees themselves in decent and humanitarian conditions? That's what we're trying to do, but we're trying to do that while working through 28 sovereign parliaments who have to approve each decision of this type.
Can I go to recognise the woman with glasses there?
Hi. So I actually had a question regarding the way the EU is set up as related to the United States, which should be one country, but it's really federal states, and how it seems that you are much more efficient when you're in different countries and we are 50 states, but we should be one country, especially now with a general election going on and how it's falling apart it seems. But also more generally in terms of how the federal system's been set up so that laws are different, and it seems to be sort of the same principle, but yet states have their own identity and they sort of do their own thing, but we can't really ever come to a consensus, even though we should really have one general federal law and just be sort of following that with small minor changes. And I thought you might be able to comment on that and maybe give us some advice.
Interesting inversion of the normal comparison.
Well, I would agree that, in general, Americans underestimate the degree of integration we have in Europe, and that, in general, Europeans have an excessively homogeneous view of the United States as though it's a single country. It is a single country, but it is a federal country, and your federal structure is very unique, and there is huge diversity in this country, far more than is felt, perhaps, perceived when looked at from outside by some Europeans. Having said that, let's be absolutely clear. You have diversity, and you have your sort of federal division between the federal level and the state level, and there's great diversity. You're still a single country, and you still do have a general election for a president, for a Congress, and ultimately the most important powers at federal level, whether that's currency, defense, foreign policy, are exercised by the United States as the United States and not by individual states. Of course, you have diversity across other policies from state to state, just as other federal states do. If I take Germany, for example, which is a single country, but which is a federal country with a lot of the individual lender have a huge degree of discretion over many areas of policy like education or social policy, even labor market policy. So I think these things are not incompatible. What I would just like to say is, we're not trying to make a single country out of Europe. And we're not even, in my view, trying to create a United States of Europe anytime soon. What we're trying to do is just get a proper balance between the national identity and the sovereignty of our individual countries, with the imperative need in the 21st century to pool our sovereignty in some of the most important areas. And also to have a fully functioning single market across all 28 member states, and indeed more broadly, because we have countries like Switzerland and Norway, Iceland, which wish to be a part of that single market, in order to have a more competitive and a more efficient economic structure for the best interests of our people. That's what we're doing. I would like to believe that in due course we will also project ourselves even more in the foreign policy and security, because I think when Europe acts as an entity, we can actually be a force for good in the world. When we are divided and unable to act collectively, then we have less influence and other people take the decisions, and I don't think that's what we should necessarily want in the 21st century. But we're not really in the business of trying to mimic what you have done in the United States in an entirely separate historical context from what we have inherited.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Actually, my question is regarding to the TTIP. The question comes from my observation during my work experience in the EU delegation to China with DG Trade. Actually, as soon as the TTIP negotiation was launched in 2012, we interviewed and communicated with several Chinese government officials and scholars regarding their opinion to the TTIP. And we observed that some of them have held the opinion that the TTIP is a signal of the EU and the US turning back from the international trade mechanisms. Instead, they are building up the cross-regional trade system by themselves. So I would like to have your comment on this opinion and your interpretation to the TTIP. Thank you.
Well, I agree that multilateral trade liberalization is the better option. And I don't think, certainly speaking for the European Union, but I also think for the United States, we have certainly not given up on the WTO or on the possibility of further multilateral trade liberalization. But if we have not been able to agree in Geneva, it's not just because of the EU or just because of the Americans, but also because countries such as China, countries such as India, have also been reluctant to reach the kind of bargain that we all could sign up to. So we have a collective responsibility for the failure of the Doha Development Agenda, on which I spent 5 years of my life, which I will never get back again. But our commitment to multilateral trade liberalization is firm, and I would hope that whatever these bilateral or bi-regional arrangements we are making, at some point we'll all end up back in Geneva trying to multilateralize it. On the other hand, it also needs to be said that we are trying to do things in these agreements which would be impossible in the WTO. You cannot have an investment chapter in Geneva. You cannot have a regulatory convergence chapter in Geneva. You cannot have a rules chapter covering issues such as competition rules in Geneva. So in any event, even if we had a multilateral trade liberalization round, you would, if you wanted a really ambitious trade agenda across the Atlantic, you would still need to complement it with a bilateral agreement. And by the way, I note that China itself has pursued quite a number of bilateral FTAs in the region as well. So I think ultimately, I know that TPP is an open platform, ultimately open to others who would wish to join. TTIP is not in the first phase an open platform in the sense that we want to negotiate it bilaterally, but both of us have said, once it is negotiated, if other countries were to express an interest in joining it, we would be perfectly open to having that discussion. So I don't think at the end of the day these arrangements are arrangements against other trading partners. They are arrangements which in the first instance we hope will benefit us. That will also have benefits for others. I mean, TPP is between the United States and 11 Pacific partners. Frankly, Europe will also benefit from it. The increase in trade and economic activity will also mean increased opportunities for our companies. TTIP will also benefit other trading partners of the US and the EU because of the overall increase in economic activity which it will generate. So I think these trade deals should not be seen as somehow exclusive and excluding, but rather as a contribution to an alternative way of trade liberalization in the absence of our ability to agree a comprehensive multilateral deal in Geneva with the WTO, which would still be the preferred solution of all of us.
Last question to the lady in the room.
Hi, I just wanted to add something that Ambassador Sullivan said earlier about the refugees. Complicating issues is also the fact that we can't assign them to certain states within the the European Union. So we can't say 20 of you go to Turkey, 20 of you go to Ireland, and another 50 go to France. They have a right to choose the state. I think it's a human right that they have as refugees. They have the right to choose the country they want to go to, and we can probably massage the intermediate steps. But it's a little bit more complicated than meets the eye on first sight, how to assign these refugees.
Well, you're right, this is a complicated factor. I mean, one of the consequences of this crisis is, I think the Commission is going to come forward this month with proposals to revamp the system in order to learn the lessons from this process. And I think one of the things that may be revisited is precisely this point. It may be that people have to understand that if they cross the external frontier of the European Union and apply for asylum status, they may then be told in which country ultimately they will have to live while their application is processed as part of this relocation process. So I think, the quid pro quo of having an open asylum and refugee policy undoubtedly has to be that asylum seekers have rights, absolutely, but they will also have to accept some obligations. Equally, the issue of returns for those whose applications are rejected will become very important. It's only possible to explain to our citizens that we keep our doors fully open to asylum seekers if we can explain that people who, when we ultimately decide that they are not asylum seekers or not entitled to protection, that they will have to be returned. That is the only way this is politically sustainable, because if it becomes understood that somehow that by applying for asylum, even then if you're rejected, you nonetheless get to stay in the country, the system will break down. So the question of organizing in a humane and well-structured way, but in a firm way, of returns out of Europe for the people whose ultimate claim for asylum is rejected will have to be an important part of the package.
Ambassador, it's been a helter-skelter conversation, but thank you so much for taking time to come and talk to us, and I'm sure everyone here feels that it's been very illuminating, actually, to have this robust defence of the EU's perspective at this point. So please join me in thanking them. Thank you very much.